1st March 1954, Bikini Atoll, Marshall Islands. At 6:45 local time, the first device of Operation Castle, codenamed Bravo, detonates on a shot barge moored inside Bikini's lagoon. Instruments at the Pacific Proving Ground have been calibrated for a thermonuclear yield of roughly 5 to 6 megatons of TNT equivalent. The actual yield is later calculated at about 15 megatons, nearly 3 times the prediction, and approximately 1,000 times Hiroshima. Design documents from Los Alamos had treated lithium-7, making up about 60% of the lithium in the dry fuel, as effectively inert at the relevant neutron energies. The device instead behaves as if the inert isotope has become additional fuel. Fallout from pulverized coral and fission products is lofted into a cloud more than 30 kilometers high and 100 kilometers across, then carried east over inhabited atolls and shipping lanes. Within days, internal reports will list Marshallese residents and US personnel as accidentally exposed to significant fallout radiation, a phrase that will define decades of medical and legal debate. The transition from theory to deliverable weapon began in earnest after Ivy Mike. On the 1st of November 1952, the United States detonated the first full-scale thermonuclear device at Enewetak Atoll. The yield was approximately 10.4 megatons, validating the Teller-Ulam configuration but requiring a cryogenic deuterium system weighing more than 80 tons. No aircraft could carry it. No missile could lift it. The device was a proof of concept, not a weapon. Los Alamos National Laboratory began work on a compact, deliverable design using lithium deuteride as fuel. Lithium deuteride is a solid at room temperature. When struck by neutrons from a fission primary, lithium-6 nuclei in the compound absorb the neutrons and produce tritium. The tritium fuses with deuterium, releasing fast neutrons that drive further fission in a uranium tamper. The result is a 2-stage thermonuclear weapon small enough to fit in a bomb bay. Operation Castle was conceived as a validation series for these dry fuel designs. The Atomic Energy Commission and Los Alamos planned 6 shots at Bikini and Enewetak between February and May of 1954. Bravo, the first and largest, would test the shrimp device, a Teller-Ulam configuration weighing approximately 23,500 pounds, with a secondary filled with lithium deuteride enriched to roughly 40% lithium-6 and 60% lithium-7, surrounded by a uranium tamper. The Pacific Proving Ground was laid out with the precision of a laboratory experiment. Control buildings were positioned on islands within Bikini's lagoon. Diagnostic barges floated at calculated distances. Remote sensors transmitted data on blast pressure, neutron flux, gamma dose rate, and fireball temperature. Ships were stationed outside exclusion zones, arrayed in concentric arcs based on predicted overpressure and thermal radiation. Joint Task Force 7 oversaw operations. The Atomic Energy Commission set maximum permissible exposure for test personnel at approximately 3.9 roentgens, equivalent to about 0.039 Gray, a dose judged acceptable for short-term military work. Meteorological criteria governed shot timing. Winds aloft had to carry the cloud away from inhabited areas, and surface winds had to remain within specified limits. Every contour on the fallout maps assumed a 5 to 6 megaton event. Evacuation thresholds, shipping exclusion zones, and safe distance radii were all calculated around that figure. A pre-test Castle planning summary described the series as tests of lithium deuteride-fueled thermonuclear devices, with yields in the multi-megaton range, but the working number for Bravo remained 5 to 6 megatons. J. Carson Mark, head of the theoretical division at Los Alamos, reportedly warned that Bravo could go big. The caution was noted, but did not alter the planning basis. The official yield estimate held. Every safety boundary around Bikini was sized for a device that existed only in calculations, and those calculations were about to be wrong. Between 1951 and 1953, weapons physicists at Los Alamos reviewed neutron cross-section data with the focus on one isotope, lithium-6. The reaction was well characterized. A lithium-6 nucleus, struck by a neutron, splits into helium-4 and tritium, releasing 4.8 million electron volts. The tritium then fuses with deuterium in a second reaction, producing helium and a fast neutron. That neutron can induce fission in uranium, or it can breed more tritium from more lithium-6. The chain was elegant and predictable. Lithium-7, the more abundant isotope, was treated differently. Early neutron data suggested it captured neutrons only slowly, or led to reactions that did not contribute useful energy. The prevailing view was that lithium-7 acted as inert ballast in the fuel. Designers focused on the lithium-6 content as the active component. This assumption had economic consequences. Enriched lithium-6 was scarce and expensive. Producing it required isotope separation on an industrial scale. To reduce costs, Los Alamos accepted lithium deuteride with approximately 40% lithium-6 and 60% lithium-7 in the Bravo secondary. The 60% was considered dead weight, mass that would moderate neutrons but not amplify the explosion. The actual physics was more complicated. At the neutron energies present in a thermonuclear detonation, lithium-7 can undergo a reaction that produces helium-4, tritium, and an additional neutron. The net effect is similar to lithium-6, tritium production and neutron multiplication. But in 1953, the relevant cross-section data were thin. Computing power was limited. Yield modeling relied on simplified assumptions. Internal Los Alamos reviews accepted these assumptions as adequate for design sign-off. The Atomic Energy Commission's technical committees concurred. A later summary would attribute Bravo's unexpected yield to unforeseen additional reactions involving lithium-7, but in the pretest period, those reactions were not part of the analysis. The cost-saving choice, using partially enriched lithium, embedded a systematic underprediction into Bravo's design. If lithium-7 truly were inert, the device's fusion yield would be capped by the 40% lithium-6 fraction. If lithium-7 contributed, the yield could be much higher. The difference was not academic. It flowed directly into safety zones, evacuation plans, and dosimetry thresholds. Classifying 60% of the fuel as inert was efficient, economical, and wrong. The oversight would soon be recorded in blast effects, fallout deposition, and human dose reconstructions across the Marshall Islands. On the 1st of March, 1954, at 6:45 local time, time-coded film and remote sensors began recording. Within seconds, many diagnostic channels saturated or failed as pressures and light levels exceeded design limits. The fireball grew to approximately 4.5 miles in diameter within 1 second. Thermal radiation vaporized the shot barge, the instrumentation tower, and several million tons of coral reef. The mushroom cloud rose to an altitude of approximately 130,000 feet, roughly 40 kilometers, spreading 25 to 30 miles across in under 10 minutes. The stem of the cloud punched a crater into the reef approximately 2 kilometers across and 75 meters deep. Several small islands were effectively vaporized. Post-shot analysis assigned a yield of approximately 15 megatons, with an uncertainty of plus or minus 5 megatons. The prediction had been 5 to 6 megatons. The device had overperformed by a factor of approximately 2.5 to 3. Much of the desired diagnostic data was lost. Instruments designed to transmit measurements before destruction were simply vaporized too quickly. Gauge arrays on nearby islands recorded blast overpressures far exceeding their calibration ranges. Control site buildings, placed to survive a 5 to 6 megaton blast, suffered unanticipated damage. Window frames buckled, roof panels lifted, equipment inside was shaken loose from mounts. The yield discrepancy had immediate consequences for fallout prediction. Every plume model, every dose contour, every downwind hazard map had been calculated using a 5 to 6 megaton source term. A 15 megaton detonation lofted far more material to far greater altitudes. The mass loading of fission products, activation products, and pulverized coral was more than double the expected value. The energy available to drive the cloud upward and outward was nearly triple. Safety planners now faced a cloud whose energy and mass loading were not in any pre-shot model. The meteorological forecast remained valid, but the scale of the event did not. As the cloud moved east, it carried not the predicted debris from 6 megatons, but fallout from 15 megatons into areas labeled safe on US maps. The National Security Archive would later describe Bravo as the worst nuclear test in US history, because of fallout, not yield alone. Underestimating yield by approximately 150% meant all downwind dose estimates and exclusion zones were underbounded. The plume was already moving over the northern Marshall Islands. On Rongelap Atoll, residents watched a bright flash on the western horizon at dawn. Hours later, a fine white powder began to fall, accumulating on roofs, food, and skin. Children played in it. Adults brushed it from their hair. No one had been warned. No sirens sounded. Rongelap was outside the planned hazard zone. Official US fallout maps had shown a narrow predicted high-dose swath, calculated for a 6 megaton yield and specific wind conditions. The actual deposition was broader and extended farther. Rongelap, Eilinginai, and Utirik, all inhabited, received heavy fallout. Modern dose reconstructions estimate an average external gamma dose on Rongelap of approximately 1.6 gray, equivalent to 160 rad. Some individuals, accounting for both external and internal exposure pathways, received effective whole-body doses, approaching 1 to 1.5 sievert, 100 to 150 rem. To provide context, 1 sievert is approximately equivalent to 10,000 chest X-rays at 0.1 millisievert each. The doses on Rongelap were orders of magnitude above peacetime public limits and far exceeded the 3.9 Roentgen maximum permissible exposure set for US test personnel. Limited on-site instrumentation meant early dose information came from later soil sampling, vegetation analysis, whole-body gamma counts, and time activity reconstructions. Fallout contour maps reproduced in National Security Archive documents and health physics analyses show the disparity between prediction and measurement. The mismodeled plume placed islanders in a high-dose field with no immediate warning and no prompt sheltering orders. Rongelap was not alone. Eilinginai, a small atoll north of Rongelap, also received heavy fallout. Utirik, farther east, experienced lower but still significant deposition. On paper, these atolls lay beyond the danger zone. In radiological reconstructions, they define the peak of early fallout dose in the Marshall Islands. The numbers told a story that official assurances did not. Instruments at the Pacific Proving Ground had been positioned to measure blast effects and neutron flux at close range. They were not designed to track fallout deposition across hundreds of square kilometers. When assessment teams finally reached the atolls with portable Geiger counters, the readings were far above background. The contrast between planning documents and field measurements was stark, documented, and irreversible. On the 2nd of March 1954, a US assessment party stepped ashore on Rongelap with Geiger counters. Instruments read levels far above normal background as they walked past residents with reddened skin and hair beginning to fall out. Project 4.1 and follow-up surveys documented symptoms consistent with mild to moderate acute radiation syndrome. Nausea, vomiting, skin erythema, beta burns in areas where fallout had settled, hair loss, and blood count depression. The Metrepal-style classification system, applied in later literature, categorized most Rongelap cases in the H1, mild, range, but at doses far exceeding peacetime public limits. Rongelap was evacuated approximately 48 hours after fallout onset. Eilinginai and Utirik were evacuated later, after further assessments. The contrast with castle planning was documented. US personnel were to be kept below approximately 3.9 Roentgens. Islanders had already received tens of times more. Early reassurances gave way to later recognition of high thyroid doses. Recent reassessment suggests an average 7.6 gray thyroid dose on Rongelap, dominated by iodine-131 and other radioiodines, versus earlier estimates up to approximately 21 gray. Thyroid doses in children were higher due to smaller gland mass and greater milk consumption. WT923 described human beings accidentally exposed to significant fallout radiation and outlined diagnostic protocols, serial blood counts, beta burn treatment, thyroid function tests, and long-term follow-up. The report became a core case study of unplanned civilian exposure to weapons test fallout. Delayed evacuation transformed what could have been a lower dose event into a benchmark for radiation health physics. Had sheltering orders been issued within hours of the detonation, external doses could have been reduced. Had residents been moved before the heaviest fallout arrived, internal contamination from inhaled and ingested radionuclides would have been lower Instead, they remained in place long enough to receive doses that later became textbook examples of radiation-induced cancer risk. The same reports that labelled most cases mild also recorded thyroid doses used decades later in risk coefficient calculations and compensation arguments. The clinical data, initially framed as accident documentation, became evidence in debates over informed consent, medical ethics, and Cold War human radiation research practices. On the USNS Patapsco, hundreds of nautical miles from Bikini, crew noticed a fine dust settling on deck. No one on board had a radiation meter. The ship was a fleet oiler, en route home with engine problems. Planners believed she was far enough from the test site to be safe. Ships within close range of Bikini were fitted with washdown systems and radiological monitoring teams. Patapsco had neither. She was outside the designated exclusion zone when Bravo detonated, but the plume reached her anyway. Later, analyses by the Nuclear Test Personnel Review Program estimated fallout arrival on Patapsco on the 2nd of March, with measured dose rates between 0.18 and 0.62 Roentgens per hour. Total crew doses ranged from 3.3 to 18 Roentgens, 0.033 to 0.18 Gray, after accounting for time above and below decks and natural washdown by rain. Few personal dosimeters were available. Most dose reconstructions rely on ship logs, meteorological back calculations, later environmental sampling, and generic time activity patterns. DNA 6035F, the Castle series report, noted that fallout on some Navy ships resulted in exposures approaching or exceeding Castle's maximum permissible exposure. On Radioactive Atoll, 28 Americans stationed at a weather outpost were also exposed. Project 4.1 documented their average dose at approximately 0.78 Gray, 78 rad. These servicemen, like the Patapsco crew, were outside the nominal hazard zone but within the actual fallout path. The reconstructions underpin later compensation programs for test veterans. They show that under-predicted yield produced under-predicted occupational exposures. Crew members on ships thought to be clear of the plume later submitted claims for radiation-related illnesses, citing dose estimates derived from these reconstructions. On a ship that planners thought was safe, reconstructed doses would later be compared directly to limits intended for men at the test site itself. The discrepancy between intended safety and actual exposure became a recurring theme in Bravo's aftermath. Numbers that should have remained theoretical, dose rates in the open Pacific, crew exposures on unmonitored vessels, became real data points in medical and legal records. Several hours after Bravo's flash lit the western sky, the crew of Daigo Fukuryu Maru, Lucky Dragon No. 5, watched white powder fall on the boat. They called it Shino High, death ash. The vessel was fishing outside the published U.S. danger area. Bravo's higher yield and wind shift pushed the plume over its location approximately 130 to 160 kilometers east of Bikini. Modern dose reconstructions estimate a mean whole-body dose of approximately 2.9 Gray, 290 rad, across the 23 crew, consistent with moderate to severe acute radiation syndrome. All initially survived, but Chief Radioman Kuboyama Akichi died in September 1954 from complications of radiation sickness, including liver failure attributed to his exposure. Ash samples analyzed in Japan identified isotopes such as strontium-90, cesium-137, and uranium-237, linking the fallout, unambiguously, to weapons testing. The boat's catch was contaminated. Panic spread over radioactive tuna. Widespread fish recalls followed. Anti-nuclear petition movements emerged across Japan. Japanese and US diplomatic records noted the test was more than twice as powerful as predicted, and fallout was blown outside the announced zone. The incident reframed Bravo from a US Marshallese problem into a bilateral US-Japan crisis. Within a year, the US government agreed to pay $2 million in ex gratia compensation for the Lucky Dragon and fishing industry claims, explicitly without accepting legal liability. Individual crew members received approximately 2 million yen each. The payment was framed as goodwill, not admission of fault. The Lucky Dragon became a lasting symbol of hydrogen bomb risk in Japanese public memory. The crew's exposure contributed to the narrative that nuclear testing posed dangers beyond national borders. Popular culture absorbed the story. Early Godzilla films drew on public fear of radioactive contamination and weapons testing. For the Marshallese, the Lucky Dragon demonstrated that Bravo's fallout had reached international waters and foreign nationals. It was no longer possible to frame the event as an internal American matter. The single fishing boat helped produce a diplomatic settlement and became a permanent reference point in debates over nuclear testing, compensation, and cross-border harm. At her lab in Tokyo, Katsuko Saruhashi measured fallout nuclides in rainwater and seawater, using them to infer North Pacific circulation patterns. Her work demonstrated Bravo fallout far from Bikini, part of a global deposition pattern from all atmospheric tests. Later studies by Beck, Simon, and others showed that all historically inhabited atolls in the Marshall Islands received some fallout, with low exposure areas such as Majuro experiencing dose rate spikes 10 to 300 times background during certain test periods. Bravo was the first and largest of 67 US nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands between 1946 and 1958. The total yield of the test program was approximately 109 megatons, often summarized as equivalent to a Hiroshima bomb every day for 20 years. Bravo alone accounted for roughly 14% of that total. Health physics analyses and work by Simon and colleagues estimated that among the 82 people exposed in 1954 on Rongelap and Eilinginai, approximately 55%, with a range of 28 to 69%, of all their lifetime cancers may be attributable to fallout. The estimate is based on dose reconstructions, epidemiological models, and observed cancer incidents in the exposed cohort. UNSEER and US Department of Energy and National Institutes of Health publications consolidated Marshall Islands doses and risks, treating Bravo as the index case for understanding early fallout health risks worldwide. The data moved the story from a test range to global radiological policy. By the time worldwide monitoring networks matured in the 1960s, Bravo was no longer just an accident at Bikini. It had become a benchmark for global weapons test fallout. Measurements in rainwater, soil, milk, and human tissue samples across the Northern Hemisphere carried the isotopic signature of the Marshall Islands tests. Bravo, as the largest single event, contributed a disproportionate share to that signature. The ocean chemists' sample flasks, once tools for studying circulation, became instruments for tracking the planetary distribution of weapons fallout. Post-shot analysis sessions at Los Alamos reran Bravo simulations, this time inserting fast neutron lithium-7 reactions absent from the original codes. Adding lithium-7 pathways plausibly accounted for the jump from 5 to 6 megatons to approximately 15 megatons, within the plus or minus 5 megaton uncertainty. The key reactions were simplified into two central chains: lithium-6 plus neutron yields, helium-4 plus tritium plus 4.8 million electron volts, followed by deuterium-tritium fusion. Lithium-7 plus neutron yields, helium-4 plus tritium plus a net neutron, also followed by deuterium-tritium events. Lithium-7 effectively provided extra tritium and extra neutrons, amplifying both fusion and fast fission in the uranium tamper. Lithium-7 was reclassified from inert ballast to active fuel. Future designs tightened yield prediction margins and weather constraints. When precise yields were required, designers moved toward higher lithium-6 enrichment, accepting the cost to reduce uncertainty. Later technical summaries stated Bravo was triple that predicted by its designers due to unforeseen Li-7 reactions. The phrase became standard in declassified reports and open literature. An isotopic re-evaluation reshaped both warhead engineering assumptions and fallout prediction doctrine for subsequent test series. Neutron cross-section tables were updated. Computer codes incorporated the lithium-7 pathways. Design reviews scrutinized secondary fuel compositions with new rigor. The same tables that once treated lithium-7 as noise now defined how designers bounded the risks of every high-yield thermonuclear weapon. The lesson was technical and procedural. Underestimating a secondary physics detail could dominate device performance and safety planning. For weapons designers, Bravo was a forcing event. It demonstrated that yield predictions carried real-world consequences in fallout, blast radius, and political fallout. It showed that cost-driven choices, such as accepting high lithium-7 fractions, could backfire if the underlying physics were incompletely understood. For the broader nuclear establishment, Bravo underscored the importance of conservative safety margins when uncertainties remained. The failure was not in the Teller-Ulam design itself, which worked spectacularly, but in the assumption that 60% of the fuel could be ignored. The cover page of WT923 was stamped and circulated among Navy and Atomic Energy Commission medical teams. The subtitle read, "Biomedical Effects." The stated aim was to study those accidentally exposed. Project 4. Point 1's objectives were to assess clinical effects, determine dose pathways, external and internal, and follow long-term consequences among exposed marshalees. Key findings in the acute phase included acute radiation syndrome signs, beta burns, and transient marrow suppression across exposure groups. Long-term findings included elevated rates of thyroid nodules and cancers, especially among those exposed as children on Rongelap and Eilinginai. Thyroid doses were re-estimated over time. Early estimates approached 21 Gray in some individuals. Recent central values are closer to 7.6 Gray, still high enough to produce significant cancer risk. The revisions reflected improved internal dosimetry models and better understanding of radioiodine biokinetics. Later criticism highlighted that marshalees were used as subjects of opportunity, with limited informed consent, even as they received essential medical care. Project 4.1 was grouped with other Atomic Energy Commission human radiation experiments in ethical reviews conducted in the 1990s. Language from WT923 and later Department of Energy Office of Scientific and Technical Information reports set out diagnostic protocols and described the cohort as accidentally exposed. The phrasing became central to legal and ethical debates. Was the exposure truly accidental, or was there foreknowledge that a test might produce high off-site doses? Project 4.1 data became central to risk coefficients, dose-response models, and compensation arguments. The same tables used to calculate medical follow-up were cited in petitions arguing that the original settlement was manifestly inadequate. For decades, these data anchored both clinical care and criticism of Cold War research ethics. The cover page of WT923, with its neutral title and official stamp, became an emblem of that dual legacy: essential medical documentation and contested ethical history. A 1955 US-Japan diplomatic note recorded an agreement. The United States would pay $2 million in ex gratia compensation for the Lucky Dragon and fishing industry claims, explicitly without accepting legal liability. Mass anti-nuclear petitions followed in Japan. Public debates intensified. The incident influenced popular culture, including early Godzilla narratives as allegories for nuclear tests. Payments to individual crew, approximately 2 million yen each, and broader industry support provided some relief, but no legal precedent for future foreign victims was established. For the Marshall Islands, the path was longer. The trust territory of the Pacific Islands transitioned to the Compact of Free Association, COFA, in 1986. Section 177 of COFA established a $150 million nuclear claims fund, with the Marshall Islands Nuclear Claims Tribunal given jurisdiction over all claims past, present and future arising from the nuclear testing program. COFA and Section 177 wording stated that the fund was intended as a full settlement of claims, and the tribunal was mandated to render final determinations. The structure was intended to provide finality, a fixed sum, a local adjudicative body, and a process to resolve historical grievances. Bravo drove both bilateral ad hoc settlements, Japan, and a formalized trust fund regime, Marshall Islands. The contrast was instructive. Japan, a sovereign nation with diplomatic leverage, received a quick settlement. The Marshall Islands, a trust territory transitioning to free association, received a structured fund designed to stretch over decades. By the mid-1980s, Bravo had been translated into fixed dollar amounts and legal language. But neither doses nor health outcomes were fixed. Dose reconstructions continued. Cancer incidence data accumulated. The gap between the $150 million fund and actual claims would soon become apparent. The diplomatic note and COFA documents represent two approaches to compensating nuclear test harm: expedient political settlement and long-term institutional framework. Both would prove incomplete. A Nuclear Claims Tribunal annual report listed over $2 billion in personal injury and property damage awards against a fund originally capitalized at $150 million. The interest-based design was intended to stretch payments beyond the principal, but market volatility and the scale of awards quickly strained the fund. By 2009, the tribunal had largely exhausted its resources. Many awards were only partially paid, initially at 15%, later at 5% of award values. A 2000 changed circumstances petition to US Congress argued that new dose data and health impacts rendered the original fund manifestly inadequate. The petition was not acted on substantively. By the mid-2010s, about half of claimants had died waiting for full compensation. Simon and colleagues estimated that in the most exposed 1954 Rongelap and Eilenginai group, approximately 55% of all lifetime cancers may be attributable to test fallout. Wider Marshallese populations showed smaller but non-zero attributable fractions, reinforcing arguments for broader screening and compensation. A fixed-sum legal settlement confronted evolving science and long-latency disease, leaving a structural gap between documented exposures and available funds. When the tribunal stopped full payments in 2009, more than $2.2 billion in awards remained unpaid, an accounting figure that translated to unaddressed human exposure. The fund was designed for closure. It assumed that $150 million plus interest would suffice. It assumed that claims would be modest and finite. Both assumptions failed. For claimants, the unpaid awards were more than legal abstractions. They represented recognized harm without remedy, documented doses without compensation, and judicial findings without enforcement. The gap between adjudication and payment became a permanent feature of Bravo's legacy, illustrating the difficulty of matching finite resources to open-ended health consequences. A 2001 Landsat 7 image shows Bikini Atoll. The Bravo crater remains a visible scar in the reef decades after the explosion. The crater is approximately 2 kilometers across, a permanent geomorphological record of the test. Bikini was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site for its role in nuclear history. Environmental surveys continue to monitor soil and food chain radionuclides. Resettlement debates persist, influenced by dose projections and by sea level rise. Case reports document Bravo's footprint at the level of individual patients. A 70-year-old Lucky Dragon survivor required special consideration for dental surgery because of historical marrow and organ doses. Medical care for exposed populations continues, spanning generations. Technically, Bravo forced recognition that secondary physics details, like lithium-7 cross-sections, can dominate yield and fallout. Operationally, it demonstrated that test range hazard zones and compensation schemes must account for uncertainties, not just best estimate predictions. Legally and ethically, it exposed the limits of finite funds and post hoc medical research in addressing involuntary exposure. The National Security Archive's 70-year review concluded that Bravo vaporized some 10 million tons of sand, coral, and water that turned into a 100-mile-wide fallout cloud, contaminating Marshall Islanders, US personnel, and Japanese fishermen. A misclassified isotope in a single test device ended up shaping warhead design, radiation risk science, diplomacy, and unresolved compensation debates for more than 70 years. 70 years after detonation, the Bravo crater, the dose reconstruction tables, and the still unpaid claims collectively show how a single underestimated isotope, lithium-7, turned one test into a long-running case study in nuclear risk, responsibility, and the limits of compensation. Bravo now stands in technical literature, legal records, and satellite imagery as a quantitative reminder that in nuclear engineering, errors in the second decimal place can propagate into entire nations' health and legal histories.